Now we need to talk about what it means to add matrices. The sum of two m by n matrices, capital X and capital Y, is another m by n matrix, x plus y, in which the elements are the sum of the corresponding entries in x and y. What this basically means is when we want to go ahead and add two matrices together, all we have to do is add their corresponding matrices. So here's an example. I have two 2 by 3 matrices. They have to have the same size if I'm going to add them together. And to add those together, I'm going to add each one of the entries that correspond. So for instance, in the first row, first column, I have a 1 and a 0. So when I add them, I get 1. In the first row, second column, I have a 0 and a -2. So when I add them, I get -2. In the first row, third column, I have a 6 and a 1. So when I add those, I get a 7. If these matrices don't have the exact same size, well then we just can't add them together and we say it's not possible. So for instance, if the first matrix is a 2 by 2 and the second matrix is a 2 by 3, since they don't have the same size, we just say it does not exist. The additive inverse, or the negative of a matrix, is a matrix minus x in which each element of the matrix is the additive inverse, or the opposite, of the corresponding element of x. So the additive inverse of the matrix 1, 4, 6 in the first row, and the second row 0, -1, 0, has the exact same size, but the only difference is I take each of the elements and make it opposite. So the 1, 4, 6 becomes -1, -4, -6, and the 0, -1, 0 becomes 0, 1, 0. Notice that if you take the original matrix and add its additive inverse, what we get is a 0 matrix that has exactly the same size. Because when we add those corresponding entries, we find that each one is going to add to 0. So when we go ahead and subtract things, as with real numbers, subtraction is defined in terms of addition. So if you want to do the matrix x minus the matrix y, all we have to do is take x and add the opposite, or the additive inverse of y. So if I have written down here the 2 by 2 matrix that has 1 and 2 in the first row, -1 and 0 in the second row, and I want to subtract off the 2 by 2 matrix that has 6 and 3 in the first row, -3 and 1 in the second row, what I really need to do is, instead of subtracting that second matrix, what I end up doing is I add the opposite. So adding the opposite means I'm going to add the 2 by 2 matrix that has in the first row -6, -3, and in the second row 3 and -1. Now I can just go ahead and match up my corresponding entries and add them. So 1 plus -6 means in the first row, first column, I get -5. 2 plus -3, when I add those up, I get -1. -1 plus 3, when I add up those corresponding entries, I get 2. And 0 plus -1, those corresponding entries give me -1. Remember, when I talk about corresponding, that means they need to be in the same position in the matrix. So let's take a look at an example with the bread, milk, peanut butter, and cold cuts in the rows, and the different convenience stores 1, 2, and 3 in the rows. And I have a whole bunch of entries there that tell me how many of each one of these were sold in week 1. And we're going to call that capital A. Now the matrix below is the exact same thing, except now it's the week after that, the week 2 sales. And we're going to call that matrix B. So if I find A minus B, what's that equal to, and what does that tell us? So we're going to go ahead and take A minus B, which basically means I need to take the matrix A and add the opposite. Essentially what we're going to be doing is we're just going to go ahead and subtract corresponding entries. So for instance, in the first row, first column, I have 88. I need to subtract 66, and that gives me 22. If I were to go to another entry, say the second row, second column, I have a 72, subtract in the other matrix 72. When I subtract those, I get 0. So I need to do that for all the different entries, and that gives me this new 4 by 3 matrix, which is now the difference between A and B. So what those entries represent is the change in sales from week 1 to week 2. So when I get a 22 in there, that meant on the first week I had 88, I subtracted 66, so there were 22 more loaves of bread that were sold in convenience store 1. I see some of these zeros in here. Wherever I see a 0, that meant in the individual weeks I sold exactly the same amount, in which case we went from 48 to 48 or 72 to 72. Basically, we're doing the same kinds of things that we would do with regular arithmetic, but now we do it to the corresponding entries, and we'll interpret things the same way, as either a sum or a difference, depending on whether you're being asked to add the matrices or subtract the matrices.